welcome to Amiga Ireland. I'm Irla.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Luke.
The history of gaming and Amiga in Italy is an interesting one, and our resident Italian Alessandro is involved with the Computer and Communications Museum of Ireland through his work, and he's going to take us through some of the highlights. How's it going, Alessandro? Benvenuto, come va?
Bene, grazie. Grazie di avermi qui con voi. Thank you for having me with you.
Buonasera.
Fantastic.
Buonasera a voi.
Good stuff. Well, we saw you recently at Amiga Ireland, and we finally have a bit of time to have a chat, because I know we've had some interesting little side conversations about the Amiga scene in Italy. But before we get to that, can you tell us what the pre-Commodore scene was like in Italy?
Okay, this is actually quite an interesting, if rather short story, because Commodore machines were effectively the enablers of game development in Italy. Before that, we really didn't have much. But what we had was actually quite iconic. And it was, for the most part, in the hands of a single company, a company called Zaccaria, which was the surname of these three brothers in Bologna, who in 1972 established a company mostly for the sole purpose of making pinball machines. Okay? It was a particular time then, because before that time, Italy was trying to import traditional pinball machines from the US. The problem was, however, that the whole market of pinball gaming was not regulated at all, and pinball machines were likened to gambling because of the ability to gain extra balls, mostly. The extra ball feature alone was considered a cause for gambling, and it was one of the reasons why it was actually pretty difficult to import pinball machines in Italy. So the Zaccaria brothers, what they decided to do was first to start adapting foreign machines for the Italian market, but they very soon realized they could just very well develop their own pinball machines. These were, again, the early 1970s. I think in the space of 16 years, they actually produced several dozens of their own pinball machines, which were actually of very high quality. So much so, in fact, that today you can actually play like a modern computer game for Windows and Linux, which on Mac, called Zaccaria Pinball. I mean, it's a computer game, and it's a 3D reproduction of the original Zaccaria pinball tables in 3D. However, interestingly enough, the three brothers soon realized that there might actually be some virgin territory for developing games. However, back then, the systems that people had in their homes were the game consoles, like, the Intellivision, Atari consoles, and the problem is that there was just not enough budget or support to be able to develop games and publish them, on cartridge. That were just not yet a feasible thing. So what they did basically was produce arcade games. Okay, and they could do that, and because of the experience they had in the past, what has been somehow the trend of initial game development in Italy, that was basically producing hacks of existing arcade games and releasing them as bootlegs. If only for translating them into Italian. And nicely enough, Zaccaria has since produced a few, not many, interesting arcade games. I can mention a few. One is called Money Money, and it was like a hybrid between a platform game and a Pac-Man wannabe, and also others like Quasar and Jackrabbit. It was a short-lived story, but quite interesting because it was mostly in the hands of one single company. And even interestingly enough, they dissolved right as Commodore machines were picking up speed in Italy.
I see. So that's sort of when Commodore came onto the scene.
Yes. Well, at least when they came in Italy. I mean,
yeah.
As Italians, we tend to be late with many things, especially when it comes to adoption of technology. Commodore 64s were already widespread 1985, 86. But nobody really did consider producing games for them until like we're 1987, 88.
Right.
And by the way, the trend of making bootleg versions of games, it actually carried forward and expanded to, encompass these machines. Commodore 64s and Amigas were actually heavily bootlegged through like shovelware compilations of, commercial games that were maybe translated, whose title was removed or changed, and they would squeeze 4 or 5 games together in one floppy disk that you could buy newsagents. So, and they could do that because, again, it was completely non-regulated, the market there. Another thing that I should mention is that for some reason, other 8-bit computers didn't quite really pick up in the country. I, for one, have never seen a running Amstrad CPC machine in the country at all. Despite it being so popular with our French neighbors, they were not really widespread in Italy. And more or less the same story goes for the ZS Spectrum. I can say right from the outset that none of the companies that actually worked on developing and publishing gaming software in the country ever did so much for Spectrum and Amstrad computers.
It was just because you were saying that it took a while for the Commodore 64 and the 8-bit stuff to arrive. So at what stage did the Amiga start to gain popularity in Italy?
Well, I would place that around 1989 for the reason alone I could project this to my own experience as a kid. When I started insisting with my family that I wanted my own home computer to do stuff with and to play with, it was exactly 1988 actually, and I was insisting on having a Commodore 64 because of all of my friends having one. My father, who was actually keen on getting cutting edge technology on some aspect, he insisted that I shouldn't really just get the machine that was going strong at the time just because the others had it. He insisted that I should get an Amiga. And around that time, like mid-1988, we started seeing commercials for Amiga 500 computers, like even on like kids' TV and that sort of thing. And it was actually being pushed as a all-rounder computer for creativity. Yeah, there was not much publicity, let's say not much advertising for Amiga 1000 or 2000 in that respect. I didn't even know about the existence of the Amiga 1000. Things really started to pick up in 1989. By then, not only I had my own Amiga 500, but also other kids at school started getting theirs. And it also coincides with the year the existing gaming companies in the country would start producing games for the Amiga, and for a short time, I should say, the Atari ST. So that is the story.
Okay, so did any more companies, come along, and what did they release actually?
Okay, well, as I said, Zaccaria didn't last long enough to actually start considering making games for Commodore 64 and the Amiga. And quite interestingly, the whole landscape of gaming production for Commodore machines was for like 3-4 years in the hands of 3 companies alone. Okay, there were 3 companies all based in northern Italy. These 3 companies were Simulmondo, Idea Software, and Genius. Now, Simulmondo and Genius were based in Bologna, just like Zaccaria, whereas Idea was just based further north in the area where Varese is, not far from Milan, you could say. And basically, these 3 companies together, up to like 1992 or so, were considered as the only reference producers of gaming software for Commodore 64 and the Amiga. I should say, in this respect, that they were also highly focused companies with respect to the genres and the coverage that they would have for their own games. They all have 2 things in common in their production. They all made extensively sports games. Every one of them published at least one football game, soccer game. And they could do that also pretty easily because, again, we're talking about 1988, 1990. It so happened that 1990 was the year where the FIFA World Cup took place in Italy.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a period where there was no such thing as extremely expensive licenses for FIFA or for the Formula One. Even if they were enforced, they were still going to be very far from being enforced in Italy. So therefore, pretty much everyone could, make their own FIFA World Cup game or their own official, so to speak, F1 GP game. And they, in fact, all did it. I mean, there have been several instances of football games. So, like, two of the earliest ones were produced in 1988 up to 1990. They were called, like, World Cup 90 and Italy 90 Soccer. They were both developed by a group of talented developers, the Dardari brothers, who actually specialized in the production of sports games for a few years on the Amiga. And, okay, there were also other sports were covered, not to mention also Formula One racing, like I said. But the other characteristic feature of the genre coverage of these companies was that they all developed and published adaptations of comic books, but mostly about Italian comic books, but not only. This was actually mostly in the hands of Simulmondo. As a matter of fact, Genius did publish gaming adaptation of the comic book Nathan Never around 1991. But in general, let's say Idea Software took up the more comedic types of comics, such as, say, Katevik or Sturmtruppen, Lupo Alberto. They're all mainly published by Idea, whereas Simulmondo covered mostly the serious comic books, if you will. So characters like Dylan Dog, Tex Willer, Diabolic, they were featured in a rather lengthy run of games that were on a monthly publishing schedule.
So can you explain the episodic game production? Like, was this like, let's say, you go to buy a comic and every week or month there's a new issue of the comic that continues the story. Was it something like that? New levels, almost like, was it like DLC or something in a way where you got new levels every once in a while for a similar style game?
You could say, in a sense, that episodic game production in Italy was really the precursor of what is considered normal today. When you look at modern gaming franchises being published in episodic content delivery model, it actually picked up speed in around 1993, 1994. Okay, and it was largely again in the hands of maybe one of the most the company that looked ahead the most. That was Simulmondo again. They had, by the end of 1992, published some standalone comic book adaptations of, like, Dylan Dog and Tex, and they were sold at retail stores. But around the end of 92, they struck a deal with Sergio Bonelli Editore, which was one of the biggest comic book publishers in the country. And the deal was such that Simulmondo would basically produce a series of games, mostly like action-adventure games, to be published every month for purchase and news agents, just like comic books. Sometimes they would be bundled with short stories as well. And sometimes they would just be published alongside existing comic books. There have been exceptions to that rule. For example, the retail published Dylan Dog game, so The Murderers, Gli Uccisori, was actually based on a short story that was written ad hoc by original writer Tiziano Sclavi. Now, you have to understand that publishing every month games from several franchises at the same time would actually prove to be a pretty taxing schedule. And for that reason, those games would tend to be very similar to each other. They would always repeat the same formula of being mostly like fixed screen, side view, action adventures with some, say, multiple selection screens for dialogue or like some basic point-and-click interfaces. And as time went by, towards 1994, it was actually less and less sustainable to keep this model going forward, which is why, for example, the point-and-click part and the dialogue screens were sometimes eliminated in the later episodic production. Although in the beginnings, comic book adaptations, and among these I already mentioned Dylan Dog and Tex, Diabolic was another one, and there were even three or four adaptations of Spider-Man. There were actually some Spider-Man games produced in Italy because Bonelli, I think, was then the licensee of Spider-Man comics for Italy. So that's why they kind of got this deal then. But they even expanded to, say, original franchises. And Simulmondo, as a matter of fact, had their own cyberpunk, heavily William Gibson-influenced franchise called Simulman. And later on, they actually teamed up with another publisher, that was Fabri and Rizzoli, through which they published an episodic series that ran for 30 volumes, and that's called Time Runners. And this is actually pretty interesting for, let's say, my non-Italian speaking friends, because it's the only one that was localized in English and in other languages. All the other episodic games were exclusive in Italian. I should also say this, yeah.
Wow.
So was it a case that they were the same main characters every time? Is there the same theme?
Yes.
Yeah.
They somehow had to save on resources and assets. You know, they had to deliver several of them every month with the same development teams. And eventually that had an impact, you could say, on their ability to follow quality standards by their own admission. And that's basically where the whole episodic game development period kind of dried up, along with other game developments for the Amiga. And that was in 1994. Okay. By then, other companies that had been born, and others had also tried to follow suit with the episodic delivery model. As a matter of fact, another publishing company called Hobby and Work in 1994 commissioned an adaptation of like a fantasy novel series called The Ancestral Trail to an Italian developer for the production of a 4-part adventure game series. Now, this developer that was called Holodream effectively developed and finalized versions of these 4 games for MS-DOS and the Amiga at the same time. However, by that time, Hobby and Work just decided not to publish the Amiga version, mostly in the wake of Commodore's demise, which pretty much spelled the end of the ability to take risks and publish games for the Amiga for old companies that hadn't been there. So the Amiga versions of the Ancestral Trail, or La Storia Ancestrale, the way they're originally titled, didn't actually see the light until 2007, when coder Fabrizio Farenga published it on his own webpage.
Very good. So, is there somewhere that all these different episodes have been archived?
I'm afraid not all of them, not all together. As part of, say, gathering information about them and even, doing just research about their own existence and the content, this is something I'm setting out to do. I have contributed quite a few Italian titles for the Amiga and Commodore 64 on the Moby Games database, but I am still to do more on all these episodic game series. From what I've gathered so far, there have been approximately 85 titles published by Simulmondo alone, to which you probably need to add like 5 or 6 other attempts at producing episodic games. But I could say with a little bit of pride, if you will, that in this respect, someone in Italy actually managed to look ahead of the market, and they were probably too much ahead of their times with the idea of having episodic game production. I mean, it only really took up how many years later? 20 years later, perhaps, with the Telltale adventure games and all that. But 20 years ago, it was really next to unthinkable. But unfortunately, because of their ties with comic book licenses, which I think have since expired, not many of these have been made available.
Okay, there is a busy Italian Amiga group on Facebook as well. Are there many Amiga or Commodore Amiga events in Italy?
I have to be pretty honest, I haven't really been seriously informed of one since the EPISA conferences that were going on in the 1990s. have little ties with the Commodore Amiga users group because for the most part they on Facebook, because for the most part they focus on past glories, but not so much for the country, but in general for their interest with the Amiga. And it just turns out that because Italians have this penchant for football, that sensible soccer has been, in a way, the reason for many Italians to play with or even remember the Amiga, I should say. But still, it has occurred more than once that through the Italian Amiga users group, I could get in touch with those Italian developers of games that were either contractors of the three main companies at the time, or those that actually came later. So in this respect, I should say that the initial Italian companies pretty much operated in a similar fashion as those in the UK, like Ocean Software. Ocean Software mostly had development in-house. They would sometimes hire contractors, bedroom programmers. They would actually employ them full-time, but mostly there was no such thing really as a development studio. It was quite a rare thing to find. That was pretty much the same thing in Italy. Companies would typically hire a team of very young, sometimes really very as young as 14, enthusiastic developers to work on a game, usually with a rather tight deadline, and then could never tell what the future would have in store for them. Sometimes they would be faced with the choice of finishing school or trying their careers as game developers. Now, the latter was really a rare thing to happen. Things like development studios in Italy really started taking up around, could say also 1992, when it was the case that some of these developers would actually start moving from one publisher to another for the games. Like Holodream the aforementioned Holodream was one such example. They had developed for Genius mostly, but they had also developed some stuff for other companies, and at some point they knocked at Team 17's door when they actually had their own Formula 1 racing game, which was then called F1 Challenge. But because it was 1993 by then, the question of having a Formula 1 license had become a real one and was being enforced. They could not publish it as F1 Challenge, and that's why you would probably know about a Team 17 published game called F17 Challenge.
Yeah.
That was eventually made in Italy.
So just going back to events for a second, when Amiga Ireland started out, we just started as an online thing and waited to gather enough people, and then we picked a central location and we met there, and that was basically how we started. So if something like that was to be repeated, say as an experiment in Italy to try and get an annual event going, where do you think would be the right place to do it?
If I could pick one, it would be Bologna, because it was a city where 2/3 of game production in Italy for the Amiga and for computers in general started. And it's one of the great academic cities of Europe. It's a city with the oldest university in Europe. Beautiful city and great to live in. I think there must be something special in the water of Bologna that inspires so much creativity and enthusiasm and ingenuity. So that's definitely where I would pick it.
Okay. So you talked a lot about games so far, but were there any applications developed in Italy around the time?
Well, I'd like to mention one, which has probably been if you want the pride of its application development. That would be Tornado 3D, which was actually the 3D modeling software that you would play somehow between Imagine and Lightwave. It was actually developed by an Italian studio called iLight. It has since been, as you know, taken over by Hagan Partner, and has pretty much been sitting with them for several years now. I think the latest releases and updates of Tornado 3D were actually made by Hagan Partner, but we're still talking about the very early 2000s. But it was effectively originally an internet production, and for that I'm actually very proud.
Absolutely. It was well regarded.
Yeah.
Were there any artists or musicians that became popular in Italy, actually?
You mean out of
Amiga
out of being a game producer?
Yeah, that's right.
I honestly can't think of one. Most of them come to my mind have somehow remained in the production of video games for modern platform, but not like they became renowned artists or musicians outside of computer game music production, for example.
Okay.
just going back to the museum that we spoke about at the beginning. So you're involved with the Computer and Communications Museum of Ireland through your work. I'm just wondering, was that part of a plan or was it a happy accident, a coincidence?
Oh, it's actually a nice story to tell. Okay, I should say at this point that I literally work next door to the museum. Like my office is literally next door. And I remember when I did the interview for the job, we're talking about August 2017. After I did the interview, the next day I was like called upon. They kind of told me, yeah, we'd like to give you the job, but we understand you might still not be totally convinced whether you want to live in Ireland and to live in Galway. So maybe it might help if we could just give you a tour of the institute, of what we have here, what activities are carried out in here. And yes, it was August, so hardly anyone was in there. And I was kind of given an exclusive tour of the museum, which at the time was, but still, I was given like 5 minutes to give myself a tour of the museum. When those 5 minutes were over, I kind of told myself that I was going to take the job. You could say a good 40% of me decided to take the job was thanks to whoever had the great idea to show me the museum after the interview.
Very good.
Nice. I've got a question regarding developers. Are there any still active, like a Commodore 64 or Amiga developers in Italy?
Well, not necessarily as Commodore 64 or Amiga developers, but several of them have remained in the game development scene one way or another. One example, let's say, is a company that was born in another region of northern Italy, which is Liguria, and that's the case of Artematica, which still exists today and was founded by former Simulmondo designers and developers. And they still produce games to this day. Mostly they also have delved in the adaptations of comic books like Martin Mister and others, but they actually have quite a diversified portfolio. And also the founder of Idea Software, Antonio Farina, in the early 1990s, founded another company called Graffiti, which is today known as Milestone, and has spent the last 20-odd years specializing in the production of racing games. As a matter of fact, Milestone has developed for many years official licensees of MotoGP and the WRC rally games, so much so that they even very recently produced one motor racing games that was sponsored by Valentino Rossi, the man himself. Another one I can mention, there's a team called Naps Team. They were the developers of the versus fighting game called Shadow Fighter originally. They've gone on to develop other games like Gekido and others. They exist to this very day, and they still develop games for PC and current generation consoles. The latest one being, I think, Iron Wings, that came out like a couple of years ago. Another one I can mention is another former Simulmondo guy, mainly a 64 developer and then game designer for the Amiga. His name is Ivan Venturi. Quite interesting, he has been working the last few years on a game called Pride Run, which is being advertised as being the first LGBT-themed game made in Italy. It's going to be like something between a Street Fighter kind of clone and a more general-purpose arcade game, but I'm honestly very curious to hear what he has in store with this game.
I've got another question regarding demo scene. Are you familiar with any demo scene or productions or any demo scene Italy-based groups?
Honestly, no, because I am not a demo scene guy in general. I have to say that with a bit of regret, I've always been a kind of a consumer of the Amiga and never really a producer, which is something that, you might say it's never too late, even 25 years after the Admiral
demise.
Admiral's demise. We might just as well, kind of get back to it. After all, I'm a programmer, although I mostly develop with high-level languages, but always had an interest in going back to the developing in low-level languages or in assembly, something like that. So going back to the old 68,000 might even, spark an interest in the demo scene as a whole. Who knows?
Okay.
And your own Amiga, Alessandro, you were telling me it was packed away in 2002, but you've brought it just recently back to Ireland. What's it like to have it back?
It was great, even though it was a partial success to try to bring it back to life. It's been a 90% success, you would say. I packed it away in 2002 when my TV died, which was like the only device I had for output to screen back then. And never to touch it again for over 16 years. As a matter of fact, I really owe this to the Amiga Ireland, both the event and its continued participation with the activities in the museum, for giving me somehow the hope and the strength to try and bring it back. So I brought back my Amiga 500, and nearly everything seems to be in order. The one thing that puzzles me right now is fixing my mouse port, as the cursors only seem to be moving up and down, not sideways.
A couple of the obvious things. Basically, there are 2 pins involved in up and down, 2 pins involved in left and right. So if either of those 2 pins are bent or broken for left or right, it won't work. But so it might be worth checking to see, because occasionally you can get pins that get pushed back into the computer and they're shorter than the other ones, or broken off or whatever. But that might be worth a look, and if that's the case, then it's easy enough to replace the socket. But failing that, there's a chip, and it's reasonably common to cause problems like this. It's just a small logic chip that multiplexes all the signals together, and that's I think it's a 74166 chip. But it's a common part, and it's if you have sort of the time to check the signals, with a multimeter, or with the sort of some sort of LED or something like that. It's worth tracing the signals in and out of that chip, because it's a fairly common fault for that chip to just die, and you can replace it. It's tricky to solder it, but it can be done very easily.
It might be the case, because I think we had a look at the pins, and they all seem to be in order, at least with the naked eye. Yeah.
It should be fairly obvious. If the pin's that badly damaged that it doesn't work, it's going to look like it's missing. So now my next guess would be that 74LS166 chip, or whatever it is. Have you any electronics experience at all?
Not much, I'm afraid. But it might just be something I develop.
Well,
with the opportunity. Let's say.
Well, that's it. The you can get the schematics are all available, you see. So it's worth downloading them, and there's some nice PDF versions, or nice scalable PDFs of them, that have been reworked, so they're quite easy to follow. And it's basically just this chip that basically it sort of swaps between the different pins and sends the signals into I think they go to Denise after that for counting the mouse movement. And so if this chip isn't working, that's it. You just don't get one of the directions.
Great. Think I could ask you to drop me a note about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So no problem. That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
Right, we've got a series of questions regarding the word favorite. So I'm going to start with your favorite mod. What is your favorite module if it comes to Amiga, if you have one?
Yeah, well, as it turns out, I'm kind of a rock and roll guy.
Oh, okay.
In many respects. I'm not so much into, if you want, the techno and disco trance side of things. So my choice is rather peculiar, and I really think my choice will have to fall on the main theme from the Chuck Rock game.
Oh, okay.
It's an absolutely brilliant rock and roll piece.
I'm trying to remember it. I don't think I know it. I'll have to look that up now.
Yeah, it's just too bad on that game you still need to choose between music and sound effects, and sound effects happen to be really great, so to speak. But
tough choice then.
If you had to make the tough choice, my choice goes on enabling the music on that game.
And if you had to pick a favorite game, would it be the same one, Chuck Rock, as well?
No, I don't think so. It would actually be pretty hard, because again, my favorite Amiga games are not surprised really. They're mostly everyone's favorite Amiga games. So I could pick like Flashback Syndicate, the first XCOM, Speedball 2.
Lotus probably.
This is actually tricky, because there is a game I prefer to Lotus. So in this case, if I were to pick a game that is in a way the underdog, not the one that not many pick as a favorite, but I would, that would be Crazy Cars 3.
Oh, okay, that's a good one as well.
I think it's an absolutely brilliant game, and yeah, I think by far is my favorite racing game on the Amiga. Sorry, Lotus, it just has that Need for Speed feel that no other game on our scene has. I'm sorry. It might be not very popular because of it's the pedigree coming from the franchise and the reputation that the company producing it had in the 80s. But it so happened that at some point, I don't know in what state of grace they were when they made it. But to me, Crazy Cars 3 is absolutely brilliant.
That's fair enough. And the last of these questions, if you had to pick a favourite application, what would it be?
Oh, I don't suppose I can mention Xcopy.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a favourite of a lot of people, I think.
No, but I meddled with Deluxe Paint 3. Although not in such a way as to become a real artist myself. But it's probably the application I've had most fun with on the Amiga myself. Yeah.
I think there's people out there whose favourite pastime in the Amiga is making copies of Xcopy using Xcopy.
Oh,
yeah. Right. Last but not least, what's your best memory of Amiga over the years? Whether recent or maybe from the past?
I should mention maybe from the recent past, so to speak. And it was when Amiga 30 happened.
Okay, cool.
That it started spawning several events, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Germany. And that was pretty much when I realized after 15 years of having been away from the scene in many ways, that there was really so much interest and still so much enthusiasm, not to mention the chance to, meet some of my old heroes in person that I never thought I would get. I never thought I would live to see it happen. And yes, it basically that was the point back in 2015, especially when I joined the first one of these events, which was the Amiga 30 in Amsterdam, then going all the way up to meeting the same people again 4 years later in Athlone just a few weeks ago. Strangely enough, my fondest memory is not from the heyday of the Amiga, probably, but from more recent years. I have no shame in revealing that. Yeah,
that's lovely.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Well, listen, Alessandro, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to take us through a bit of the Italian Amiga history. We're going to put a couple of links in the show notes that you can go and check out.
Thank you,
any of those items we talked about if you want to learn more about them. And we'll see you soon at the museum, and we'll maybe take a look at that Amiga 500 again.
We're not many weeks away, I think, from having another go at it, right?
That's right, yeah. And if you're listening and you'd like to attend, we meet once a month in the Computer and Communication Museum of Ireland. It's based in Galway. And you just need to drop us an email at info@amigausers.ie just to make sure space is limited there. We definitely have plenty of space at the moment, but there would be a cap at some stage. So just get in touch and we can make arrangements from there. Yeah, okay, so thanks again, Alessandro, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 So, see you soon. Bye-bye.